Good morning. It's really good to be here again, and I'd like to open up with a piece of scripture from Psalm 119, and this is a piece that meant a lot to Vincent. Psalm 119, and we're going to just read a few verses, starting at verse 17. Do good to your servant, and I will live. I will obey your word. Open my eyes, that I may see wonderful things in your law. I am a stranger on earth. Do not hide your commandments from me. My soul is consumed with longing for your laws at all times. You rebuke the arrogant who are cursed, and you stray from your commands. Remove from me scorn and contempt, for I keep your statutes. Amen. We're going to look, first of all, has anybody here ever been to an art therapy session? Art therapy? Okay, we're going to have some art therapy first, okay? This is mainly for the American friends that are here, not for Canadian Ross. You're okay. You can stay out of it. But I just want you to, after me, I want you to say a few words, okay? Just to get things, in the right context, okay? And I want you to repeat after me, Gogh, not go. Yeah, ready? 1, 2, 3. Gogh, not go. Okay? 1, 2, 3. Gogh, not go. Okay. I know in America that Vincent is known as Vincent van Gogh. I don't know why that is, but it's Vincent van Gogh. Okay? You can look that up on YouTube. There's lots of different people pronouncing it and telling you how to pronounce it. It's the GH, och, Gogh, not go. Okay. So we're going to look at his life, and we're going to see how, in one sense, that, very much that he actually relates to what you're about as pastors, as people who have gone out from your homeland to a different place, because that was something that was very important to him in his early life. He grew up in a Christian home. His father was a Dutch pastor minister, and I'm not sure if we can see that. It sort of touches on his early beginnings. Vincent van Gogh was born 1 year to the day from another Vincent van Gogh. There was another Vincent van Gogh who died just shortly after childbirth. And Vincent van Gogh, the painter, was born 1 year to the day after that. So that was quite a big thing, profound thing for him, because the church that his father ministered in Noonan, in the graveyard, he would have walked past it every morning. The church was the grave with his young brother's name on it, the same name as him, Vincent van Gogh. And I often wondered about that and wonder, was Vincent trying to live two lives? Was he trying to live for the first Vincent as well as his life? Which is a heady concept to consider. And one of the great things about Vincent van Gogh is that we can actually know a lot about him because he documented his life for 10 years by writing letters to his brother Theo. So if you look at his life like a stage play, he's on stage, but there's one person off stage, and that's his brother Theo. And Theo was a big help. He was a younger brother, and he helped Vincent and encouraged him. And Theo was an art dealer based in Paris, and he supplied, he supplied aid to his brother by sending him 50 francs a month. And that basically was what Vincent had to survive on. But Vincent sent him paintings in return, and Theo couldn't sell the paintings. People just weren't ready for the paintings at that stage. So we can know a lot about his life because of the letters. Vincent van Gogh died at the age of 37 years old. He started painting when he was 26, 27 years old. So he painted for 10 years only. And his work and his approach to art and what he painted changed art history. He was, in many ways, a lot of scholars think, the father of modern art. And his letters show his journey and pathway through life, from life into life. And his early life was rooted in a Christian family, Christian background. And later, as a young man, he had a conversion to Christianity. This is Vincent at 14 years of age. And he had these amazing china blue eyes. You can't see it there because there weren't colour photographs in those days. But if you look, you can see this intensity in his eyes. It's 14-year-old Vincent van Gogh. You look into that face, you look into those eyes. That face, that mind, that heart was going to change the course of art history by what he saw and by what he wanted to record. This is a photograph of his mother and father, Theodorus and Anna. Theodorus van Gogh died in 1885, and Anna lived to 1907. And Anna outlived her. She had 3 sons. She outlived them all. This is the church where Vincent's father ministered in Noonan. And this is a painting that Vincent made of the church, an early painting. So he had an encounter with God. He read the sermons of D.L. Moody. He read the sermons of C.H. Spurgeon. And at the age of 22, in Paris, I can't find the exact venue, he had this step of faith outside the tradition that he grew up in, into a living, reborn faith in Christ. And that had a big impact on his life. The great thing about Vincent van Gogh, as I said earlier, is that we can know what he thought, what he said, even on a particular day. Because he wrote thousands of letters to his brother Theo. He painted about 200 pictures a year in those 10 years. And he preached his first sermon he was working with a Methodist minister, a Welsh Methodist minister called the Reverend Thomas Slade Jones. And he was based in, he went to live in London for a while, and he worked in Ramsgate and Isleworth. And that's where he preached his first sermon. And the really good thing about his first sermon is we actually have a letter where he writes to Theo, and he's just finished preaching his first sermon. And he talks about it. And we're going to hear from Vincent right now. We're going to hear his words in that letter to his brother Theo.
Dear Theo, last Sunday, your brother preached for the first time in God's house, in the place of which it is written, "In this place will I give peace." Enclosed is a copy of what I said. May it be the first of many. Psalm 119:19. I am a stranger in the earth. Hide not thy commandments from me. When I stood in the pulpit, I felt like someone emerging from a dark vault underground into the friendly light of day. And it is a wonderful thought that wherever I shall go from this day forward, I shall be preaching the gospel. To do that well, one must have the gospel in one's heart. May he grant that. God says, "Let there be light," and there is light. He speaks, and it is there. He commands, and there it stands, and stands firm. He who calls us is faithful, and shall accomplish it. You know enough of the world, Theo, to realize that a poor preacher is quite alone as far as the world is concerned. But he can increasingly arouse in us awareness and belief. And yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. I know in whom to place my trust, though day and night may come and go. I know the rock on which I build. He never fails who saves me yet. And come the evening of my life, worn out with care and strife, I will for each day granted me on earth, the air with praises to thee fill. It is a good word, that of St. Paul, as being sorrowful yet always rejoicing. For those who believe in Jesus Christ, there is no death and no sorrow that is not mixed with hope, no despair. There is only a constantly being born again, a constantly going from darkness into light. They do not mourn as though who have no hope. Christian faith makes life to evergreen life. We are strangers in the earth. Hide not thy commandments from us. But may the love of Christ constrain us. Entreat us not to leave thee, or to refrain from following after thee. Thy people shall be our people. Thou shalt be our God. I hope to preach on John in Mr. Jones's church a week this Thursday. And the Lord added daily to the church such as should be saved. Your brother was very deeply moved when he stood at the foot of the pulpit and bowed his head and prayed, Abba, Father, in thy name be our beginning. Your very loving brother, Vincent.
That's quite a revelation. You don't often see that in the books about Van Gogh. Scholars often skip over that part of his life. But he had a genuine regenerating experience. He talked about being born again, even back then, and was a very dedicated follower of Christ. And so dedicated that he wanted to go off and serve Christ and bring Christ to other people. And he was able to do that with a missionary society. He went to a place called the Bornage, but this was a recently discovered drawing. I'm not encouraging people to draw on hymn books while there's a sermon taking place in church, but this is one that was actually found in the hymn book in that church that we showed, and it was just discovered not that very long ago. I'd say I think it was in the 1980s, and it was drawn in 1881. So he'd been sitting in church. I'm not sure if he was bored with his father's sermon, but he was certainly using the art of illustration to capture a lady in the pew just down from her. So Vincent, in many stories, in many ways, his story is a story of a pilgrim on this journey. And he didn't know at that stage where that journey was going to lead him and take him. So he went to an area that no other missionaries wanted to go to. It was an area of Belgium, in Belgium called the Bornage, and it was a coal mining district, and it was amongst the coal miners that he went to be a pastor. And he started up a little house church in that area. And they had a nickname for him because he was so compassionate. They called him the Christ of the mines, because he would go into the mines with the workers. When there was an accident or a cave-in or someone was hurt, he would be there. He would be with the miners. He gave away his clothes, his possessions, and lived in a little, very, very simply. And as I say, he started up a house church in the village. That's the church actually he preached his first sermon in. And this is a photograph that was taken in 1997. And this is a guy called Giovanni Russo, and he is a Bornage miner who rests on his bed, and he had a broken back in an accident in a cave-in 45 years before that photograph was taken. So in that area, there are still people who are dealing with the consequences of that industry, which is almost gone now, but that's a legacy and an example of the type of people that Vincent interacted with and that he went to be with. This is the house where Vincent held his meetings, and he had prayer meetings and Bible studies in this house, and that's where he started his house church. And he was very aware of this idea of people who worked with their hands, and this idea of doing good work. And he saw the miners in that village in very, very desperate conditions. And even when he was ministering, he made this drawing of people carrying cold slack on their backs. You can see to the right of the picture, if you can see it, there's a little crucifixion and a little box on a tree. And he believed that the miners' lowly status brought them closer to God. That this was something that helped them get closer to the person of Christ. And that Christ understood those who were lowly in life. So he spent many nights with people who'd been burnt in mining accidents and nursing them and being close to him. This is another photograph of the Bornage, and this was in the early 1950s. So it shows you what sort of conditions people were living in even then. And as I said, Vincent gave away his clothes to the miners, gave away his possessions. The missionary oversight came to find him one day to see what was happening, and they wanted an update. And they found him covered in coal dust and unkempt. And they said, "Why are you living like this? Why are you like this? You should be setting an example to these people." And he'd been reading a book by Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. And Vincent said, "If I am to preach Christ, I am to live like Christ." So they said to him, and this is a quotation, "You're being excessively enthusiastic about your mission." And they cut off his support. And they just didn't get it. So he stayed in the Bornage for one more year. He had to fast. He had virtually no money. He was almost at the end of that year starving. And then he had to leave. He had to walk away. But not only did he walk away from the Bornage, not only did he walk away from his mission, but he walked away from the church because he'd been hurt by the church. And that's something I'm sure that we've all experienced. At different times we get different kinds of hurts, but that was a big hurt to him because he believed that God had called him there to do this work. So he walked away, and as far as I can recollect in my research, he never put his foot inside a church again for the rest of his life. So he walked away from his preached life, and he walked into his painted life. And there's an amazing quotation here at the bottom of that image by Paul Gogh, who was a contemporary of Vincent van Gogh, someone that Vincent van Gogh looked up to. And it's an amazing quotation. "The Bible set on fire this Dutch brain." The Bible set on fire this Dutch brain. So Gogh found it very hard to contend with Vincent, even when he'd come away from the mission field. And he was Gogh was a pretty feisty character as well. So they shared a studio, but this is the beginning of the painted life. And as far as I can see it, and I think Vincent saw it like this as well, it was a different way to preach. It was another calling. So instead of preaching to the people, the poor, those that he wanted to be amongst, he started to paint them. He started to record them. And he went back to Noonan, to Holland, and his father reluctantly allowed him to use a lean-to house at the back of the manse as a studio. And that's where he started to paint. So he would go out into the fields and he would look at the field workers, and his eye was opened to this other way of seeing. He was seeing outwardly, whereas before he had seen inwardly. So he wanted to record this. So this is a piece of work he did based on an etching by Millet, who was a French artist that Vincent looked up to. Millet painted the French peasant people, and he was one of Vincent's heroes. And so it was a symbol as well, obviously the sower of new beginnings, new hopes, and this new mission that he was taking on in this church without walls, where he found himself. And so he would paint and draw, and this is like just starting out, early days in this 10-year period of his painted life, the people that he would have seen around him. And he saw it very clearly as a mission to record the poor and the farm workers and the weavers, and his paintings became his sermons. And he had this obsession about reapers and the harvest that reappears in his work a lot. He was in Noonan in 1855 when he didn't know it, but he'd started actually preparation on his first masterpiece. And many scholars and art critics would contend that his first masterpiece was a painting with earthy realism, and it was a painting of potato eaters. And that was a very important crop in that area. So Vincent started to go out around and amongst the cottages, recording and painting those people who worked in the fields. And it's a very moody palette. It's the north of Holland. The light's very atmospheric and moody. There's not a lot of bright sunlight. Probably it's a bit like Ireland in that sense. In the summertime, it's sometimes you get some bright days. So these are some of the people he would have seen in the cottages, who worked in the fields, and he worked on this, collecting these studies of real people, and he started to make this painting, compose this painting called The Potato Eaters, which we can see here. And if you look at it carefully, you'll see it's a family, and Vincent talks about the idea of wanting the family, the people who harvested the crop, who planted the crop, almost to have the complexion in their skin almost of potato skins, of this earthiness. And if you look at that image, you can see it's a very simple interior. There's three things that I've sort of sought out. It might be hard to see it on that slide, but there's a little print of a crucifixion to the top left. There's a lamp in the middle, and then on the wall there's a little clock. So there's a lot of symbolism in there. But he didn't know it, but he knew something was happening with his painting. And this was his first masterpiece. And the great thing about this is that he wrote a letter to Theo about it. And we're going to hear what Vincent says in the letter to Theo now.
My dear Theo, my warmest good wishes for good health and peace of mind on your birthday. I should have liked to send the painting of the Potato Eaters for this day, but although it's coming along well, it isn't quite finished yet. Though the actual painting will have been completed in a comparatively short time, and largely from memory, it has taken a whole winter of painting studies of heads and hands. And as for the few days in which I've painted it now, it's been a tremendous battle, but one for which I was filled with great enthusiasm, even though at times I was afraid it would never come off. The point is that I've tried to bring out the idea that these people eating potatoes by the light of their lamp have dug the earth with these selfsame hands they are now putting into the dish, and it thus suggests manual labor and a meal honestly earned. I wanted to convey a picture of a way of life quite different from ours, from that of civilized people. So the last thing I would want is for people to admire or approve of it without knowing why. If a peasant painting smells of bacon, smoke, potato steam, fine. That's not unhealthy. If a stable reeks of manure, all right. That's what a stable is all about. If a field has the smell of ripe corn or potatoes or of guano and manure, that's properly healthy, especially for city dwellers. Such pictures might prove helpful to them, but a painting of peasant life should not be perfumed. Painting life is a serious business, and I, for one, would blame myself if I didn't try to make pictures that give rise to serious reflection in those who think seriously about art and life. I still have a few smaller studies, but you will appreciate that I'm being kept so busy by the larger one that I've been able to do little else. As soon as it is completely finished and dry, I shall forward you the canvas in a small packing case. I believe that the Potato Eaters will turn out well. As you know, the last few days are always tricky with a painting, because before it's completely dry, one can't use a large brush without running a real risk of spoiling it. And changes must be made very coolly and calmly with a small brush. That's why I took it to my friend and asked him to make certain that I didn't spoil it, and why I'll be going to his place to apply those finishing touches. You'll certainly see that it has originality. Regards, I'm sorry it wasn't ready for today. Best wishes once again for your health and peace of mind. Believe me, with a handshake. Ever yours, Vincent.
So this was a painting that he wanted to send to his brother as a birthday gift. He didn't meet the deadline, but Theo did get it. And if you look at the painting as well, it's a painting about communion. It's a family communing together. It's almost like they are breaking bread in one sense. And so you can see the preacher's eye, in this scene and this composition, and how important it is. Around this time in 1885, Vincent's father died just outside the front steps of his manse of a heart attack. And this had a big impact on Vincent. He argued with his father, but he loved his father very much, and his father loved him. And Vincent painted this picture just after the death of his father, and it's an open Bible. And you're not going to believe this, but that Bible is actually still in that church in Noonan, and that's the Bible that his father preached from. It's opened at Isaiah. You'll see a candle to the right-hand side, which has been snuffed out, which has gone out. And you'll see a little yellow book in the foreground, which is a book of modern poetry. It sort of symbolizes Vincent's moving on from his preached life, and he's engaging with literature and things like that. But that was a homage to his father. It's quite an amazing painting, and quite a few critics have written about that and the symbolism in it. Vincent couldn't really afford to pay for people to model for him at that stage, so he would paint things that were just around him, like his own boots. And these were the boots that he probably would have worn to preach in, and would have worn through the fields. And you might just think, well, it's just a painting of a pair of boots. What's so important about that? But those boots hold the invisible presence of a man. They hold the invisible presence of a man, and they trace his earthly footprints as well through his life, his pathways, his life's journeys, and in a sense they hold his being, and they will carry him to another place where he will paint, and things will be different for him. And this is the next stage of his life. So he's in the north, and now he's going to move to the south. And this is like where things start to change in a radical sense. It's a bit like, do you remember years ago there was black and white TVs before colour TV? Well, like the Dutch paintings were like black and white TV, and now he's moving into full Technicolor colour when he moves to the south of France, and things start to change. His colour palette opens up, and we see a different Vincent. This is one of his first self-portraits in the south of France, in Arles, and you can see the colour difference. You can also see a pattern starting to emerge in the surface of the painting. And Vincent would be considered to be a post-impressionist. He came after the Impressionists. He was very much alone in his style, and developed this style on his own. He was influenced by people like Millet, and he looked at people like Gogh, but he developed his own notation, his own language in paint. And all of a sudden, his paintings were filled with heat and sun and light and colour, that you can almost feel pushing out of the canvas, or like pushing from behind the canvas, almost like someone has a bright light shining out from behind the canvas out through the brushstrokes. Vincent had an idea at this time. This is his bedroom. It's quite a famous painting. I know Ray had a poster of that. Yeah. And recently, the room was reconstructed from the painting, which is sort of a nerdy thing to do. But some people like that kind of thing. I'd rather look at the painting. So he's now in the south of France, and he's now experiencing what we're experiencing today, this fullness of light, and it's really impacting his colour palette. And he's flipped to this Technicolor, and he's still out walking along the byways in the fields and painting people that he sees around. He didn't have any money. It was Theo who was financing him with the 50 francs, which was a minimal amount to live on. And around 1888, Theo encouraged Gogh to go and stay with Vincent in the south of France in a place which is called the Yellow House, which he painted. And Vincent wanted to start up this artist's colony to impact that area. It was almost like another mission. He went out and he bought 12 chairs. That's recorded in a letter, and art historians look at that and think, wow, is that symbolic of, this new 12, these new disciples of art? But the one thing he did, he did for Paul Gogh, he painted 5 paintings for his arrival to hang in the Yellow House, and these paintings were they're quite famous, the sunflowers. And while he was painting the sunflowers, he was fasting. He had no food. He hadn't even the money to pay for the paints. He still owed the money for the paints. So in 1888, he painted the 5 sunflowers. In 1987, at Christie's, you can see, while Vincent was waiting for the 55 francs, it was actually 55 francs from Theo, this painting was sold for 24 million pounds. Okay. In Christie's, when something like that happens, people applaud, but they're not applauding the painting, they're applauding the money. They're clapping for the money. And Vincent, I think, would have had mixed feelings about this. I don't think he would have liked it. This has now become something else. It's become a big commodity for hedge funders or for banks, for corporates, for big organizations as investments. And the paintings that he made for his friend as a sort of house welcoming gift, were now starting to make record prices on the market. He would not have believed that while waiting for those 55 francs and having not paid for the paints that he used to make the pictures. So all along this pathway, Vincent would meet people in the local villages, but he was still very much a loner. He was still very much alone. There's lots of things that have been written about Van Gogh, lots of misinformation, lots of cliches. There was a recent book written by Pulitzer Prize winners about Van Gogh being murdered by a teenage gang in a rural French field, which I find a bit far-fetched, and there's not a lot of evidence for. But it made good publicity, and I think the book became a bestseller. It's a bit like theology. Sometimes the more sensational things are, the more people are attracted to it, even if it's not true. And if they can't say it's not true, they'll still read it or go to it or be part of it. So he finds himself fighting this inner darkness. Even in this place of light, there's this contention inside. And he suffers from, at this stage, mild depression. He's developed epilepsy. And he's an outsider. I mean, he's Dutch in the south of France, which is, in those days would have been a big thing. So he finds himself now at the age of 36 in Saint-Rémy, and he's now relapsing into this depression. And he meets this young doctor who's befriends Vincent, and he's a really nice guy, and Vincent paints his portrait. And the doctor is called, a doctor's called Dr. Felix Ray, and Vincent paints Felix Ray's portrait. I think I've got it on here somewhere. Yeah, this is after Vincent has a major relapse. You probably all know about the year bit. I was talking to somebody who said, about the year, and somebody else talked about the swirly paintings. That's how he's been cliched. But this is when he was in the asylum. I mean, he wasn't taken in a straitjacket to the asylum, screaming and kicking. He went there voluntarily. In fact, he had his room in the asylum was like a studio. So he painted. It gave him time to regain his confidence and to regain his strength. And this is the room, and this photograph was taken way back, I think, in the 60s. But you can go and visit. Maybe some people who have been to the asylum and actually visited his room. And but the window looked out onto these beautiful fields, and that inspired him to paint pictures. This is a picture that he painted around that time, and you can see it's a picture of prisoners in almost like a prison courtyard. You can't really see it in that because it's not a very big image, but there's a prisoner looking out. Everybody's walking in a circle, and then in the middle there's a guy who's just looking straight at the viewer, and it looks a bit like Vincent. And the top part of the picture, just going out of the picture plane, there's a butterfly flying away. So it's this idea of change and him hoping for change, and this idea of release from this condition that he finds himself in, this depression. This is the gardens of the asylum, which is like that today still. You can go and visit it. It's not that very far away from here. This is a very important painting and would be seen as Vincent's, one of his major masterpieces. And it's a painting called Starry Night. Not Starry, Starry Night, but Starry Night. There was a beautiful song written by Don McLean called Starry, Starry Night, which is really amazing, which helped bring Vincent to a different audience. This is a really symbolic painting, if you look at it. Its original title was Eternity's Gate. That's what he called it, Eternity's Gate. So you can see it's quite cosmic in the sky, like the sun and the moon and the stars are swirling around. And if you look in the middle of the picture, you'll see a church. And this is a French landscape, but the church is a Dutch church. The architecture is Dutch. And if you look very carefully, and it's going to be hard for you to see it on this image, you'll see that there's a village around the church, and that every light is on in the house in the village, but there are no lights on in the church. And so this is heavily symbolic. It's painted towards the end of Vincent's life. It's his last masterpiece, and it mediates between two worlds. It mediates between heaven and earth. And it's about sowing and reaping, and the world at eternity's gate. That was its original title. So he's moving from one world into the other. He's having this inner turmoil, which is, hard for him to deal with and hard for others around to understand. Theo was trying to help him. And so, in a way, this painting, its original title, Eternity's Gate, was, in one sense, Vincent preparing for another journey, for a journey beyond, our time, our temporal time. And so, it could be seen as a new vision of what art could be, a revelation of heaven on earth. And that was his last masterpiece. It's an amazing painting if you ever get to see it. So we now move into Vincent's last journey, which is a sad part of his life and very melancholic. He painted these amazing landscapes. In the last 70 days of his life, he painted 70 pictures, which was pretty amazing. And these are some of those pictures. And this is his brother Theo, and Theo's wife, Johanna. And Johanna was an amazing person. Theo died 6 months after Vincent. They're both buried together in a little cemetery. It's like it would bring you to tears, when you read the story. But when Theo died, Johanna took on the responsibility of collating and collecting all Vincent's letters. Vincent didn't keep all Theo's letters, but Theo kept all his letters. And so you can buy like a 3-volume set of his letters over 10 years, which is amazing. And so she's a big responsibility. She put on exhibitions of Vincent's work. She organized things in Paris, in different parts. She brought his work to the public. So she played a big part behind the scenes in helping to promote his work. Theo, you can see a picture of Johanna with their son. They called their son Vincent, after Theo called it after his brother. He lived until the 1980s, that child. He was a doctor. There's some brilliant photographs of him. He looks very like his uncle when he's older. In the last, months of Vincent's life, he started to paint pictures that had biblical themes, and this is a picture of the Good Samaritan. And in this picture, you may find it hard to see there. Vincent started to put himself into the images. So the Good Samaritan, helping the person who's been beaten and robbed under the horse, is actually Vincent's face on that figure. And this one, if you look again carefully, you'll see it's the raising of Lazarus. And as Van Gogh rose out of his mental confusion, and went back into it again, this was an important picture of Christ, of Lazarus being raised, of Lazarus, death, and the melancholy that his sisters had. So these pictures, in the next 70 days, one picture a day, the brushstrokes came like clockwork. He just couldn't stop painting. And it was a way of putting things down. This is quite a fundamental picture. It's Christ, the dead Christ. And again, it's Vincent's face, where Christ's face should be. So in these paintings, we see a trembling, a pulse in the brushstrokes. And he wanted people to see something beyond just the painting. He wanted people to see something that was deeper, and something about the human condition. About 2 weeks before Vincent died, he went to visit Theo in Paris when the young Vincent was born. He was so poor, he couldn't bring a gift. All he could bring was a bird's nest. He brought a little bird's nest as a gift. Johanna records in one of her letters that Vincent arrived at their apartment in Paris and wanted to see, the child who'd been named for him. And she says that Theo and Vincent went to the room where the baby was in the cot, and she was in the front room of the apartment and wondered what they were doing. They'd been awake quite a long time. So she went to see them both staring into the room over the cot, and Vincent was crying. He had tears in his eyes. So we're going to hear now one of his last letter. There was another letter that was found in his pocket at his death. It was never posted. But this is the last letter that Vincent wrote to Theo, and it's about him recalling his life and thinking what could have been, and maybe what should have been, but what had to be.
Dear brother and sister, the letter from Yo has really been like a gospel for me, a deliverance from the distress caused by the hours I shared with you, which are rather difficult and trying for us all. It is no small matter, and we are all made aware that our daily bread is at risk. No small matter when, for different reasons, we are also made aware of the precariousness of our existence. Back here, I too still felt very sad, and the storm which threatens you continued to weigh heavily on me as well. What there to be done? Look, I try to be reasonably good-humored in general, but my life is also under attack at its very root. My step is also unsteady. I was afraid, not entirely, but a little nevertheless, that my being a burden to you was something you found intolerable. But Yo's letter proves to me clearly that you do realize that I'm working and making an effort just as much as you are. So, having arrived back here, I have set to work again, although the brush is nearly falling from my hands. And because I know exactly what I wanted to do, I have painted 3 more large canvases. There are vast stretches of wheat under troubled skies, and I didn't have to put myself out very much in order to try and express sadness and extreme loneliness. I hope you'll be seeing them shortly, since I'd like to bring them to you in Paris as soon as possible. I'm fairly sure these canvases will tell you what I cannot say in words. I often think of the little one. I don't doubt it's better to bring up children than to spend all one's nervous energy on making pictures, but it can't be helped. I am, or at least I feel I am, too old now to retrace my steps, or too long for anything else. That longing has left me, but the mental suffering remains. I was very sorry not to have seen Guillaume again, but I'm pleased he's looked at my canvases. If I had waited for him, I should probably have stayed talking to him so long I would have missed my train. My money won't last me very long this time, for on my return I had to pay the bill for the luggage from Arles. I have some very good memories of that journey to Paris. A few months ago I hardly dared hope to see my friends again. Wishing you both luck, a stout heart, and comparative prosperity, may I ask you to tell Mother and our sister once again that I think of them very often. Indeed, I had a letter from them this morning and will be replying soon. Handshakes and thought, ever yours, Vincent.
So things are in a very desperate state now, and Vincent has been to Paris to see his brother. He realizes his brother has a responsibility with his child, that he can't support him anymore. Vincent has no other source of income, and he's seeing this as almost the last mile. And things are getting very sad and very lonely, and he's considering all these things. And while Theo sent Vincent money, Vincent sent him the paintings. It wasn't like a charity act. Vincent was sending Theo paintings. Theo couldn't sell the paintings. Vincent sold one painting about 3 weeks before he died, around that time, for, I think it was something like maybe 45 francs. A painting called The Red Vineyard. And it was bought by the sister of a poet friend, a guy called Eugene Bloch. And that was the only painting that he sold in his life. Yeah, I mean, this is quite an important picture. This would be seen as one of his last pictures, one of his last masterpieces. And it's this picture actually begins and heralds modern art. This is one of the pictures that helps bring in the era of modern art. Nobody knew that at the time. It was painted by an obscure Dutch painter that no one had ever heard of. But if you look at the painting very carefully, there's 3 pathways in the painting. And the center pathway leads out. It does not end, and the crows are not flying away, but he sees the crows as restorative forces. Almost like his demons were in the crows, and they were being, these hurts, these worries, these troubles were being taken away, and he was being given this new pathway through the harvest to a new destiny beyond the horizon, into a world beyond sight, a world of light. So that's quite an important picture. I mean, it's an amazing picture when you see it. It's almost abstract. The brushstrokes are so wild and cross-hatched, and it's a very powerful, intense picture. So now we come to the last stage of his life, and the tragedy of Vincent's death, which is very, very desperate for Theo, his brother, as well. On the 27th of July, as you'll see in the text, he was out in the fields painting. Another doctor that he met, Dr. Gogh, who Vincent wrote off in letters saying that he thought he needed help, that this doctor actually needed mental help, who was meant to be treating Vincent, gave him a gun so he could scare the crows in the fields, which was a very foolish thing to do. And so Vincent, in his depressive state, took the gun and shot himself in the chest. And the bullet hit his diaphragm. It deflected from his heart. And he was able to make his way back to his room. This is the little cafe he lived above. And he lived in the attic space of the cafe, and this is the family actually outside the cafe that he would have known, and I think there's one of the little girls there he painted. But he made his way back to that little attic room. I mean, it was a very, very small space that he lived in, and there's a photograph of the room. The room's actually still like that today. You can go and visit that room. There's a glass panel in front of the door, and you can look in, and you can see on the wall nail holes where he'd hammered nails into the wall to hang his pictures. And that's where he went back to, and that's where he would pass away. They were able to get news to Theo in time, and Theo came the next day. So this would be the room where Vincent would pass from time into eternity. And in this room would be eternity's gate for Vincent. And they decided not to remove the bullet from his chest. It just had entered just below his heart. And as I say, Theo was sent for, and Theo arrived at midday the next day, which is pretty quick. Vincent and Theo spoke a few words in Dutch, and Vincent's last words to Theo, and his last words were, "I wish I could go home," which is pretty profound. So on the 29th of July, at 1:30 a.m. on a starry summer night, Vincent was dead. He was just 37 years old, and in his pocket there was an unmailed letter, and it said in the letter, "There are many things I should like to write about, but I feel it is useless. I feel it is useless." And it was very difficult for him, and Theo tried to help him, and others were starting to become aware of his work. There's a young art critic mentioned in the last letter who was starting to write about his work, and but it was all a bit too late for Vincent, in one sense. This is the grave of Vincent and his brother Theo. They're buried together. It's a very simple little grave, stones, and gives their dates and says at rest. So his funeral service was quite a profound experience for his few friends. There was only about 6 people attended his funeral. The priest in the village where Vincent died would not let the hearse be used because he was a suicide. And Theo had to go to another village where there was a more liberal priest to borrow a hearse. And a young artist came who knew Vincent, and he records some things in a letter about the funeral service. And he talks about there was just 6 people who accompanied Theo as they walked behind his brother's coffin in the searing heat of a July summer. He says there were sunflowers everywhere, masses of yellow flowers, and they were thrown into his grave as well. In a letter to his mother, Theo wrote this: "He had found the rest he could never find on earth. Oh mother, he was so my own brother." And Theo died 6 months later and was laid to rest beside the brother he loved. Vincent van Gogh's death, in many ways, in obscurity, with 7 people at his funeral, with a priest who wouldn't let a hearse be used to take his coffin to the grave, was a moment of resurrection. Because once that coffin hit that soil, this resurrection began. It was the resurrection in his work, the resurrection of his mission, the resurrection of his pilgrimage, which has impacted so many people around the world with his work. His friend Emile Bernard wrote in a letter about, Vincent wrote this to Emile Bernard just before not long before he died, maybe a few months. He said, "Christ alone has affirmed a principal certainty: eternal life, the infinity of time, the nothingness of death, the necessity of serenity and devotion." And talking about Christ, he lived serenely, despising marble and clay as well as colour, working in living flesh. So even at this late stage, Vincent was still reflecting on Christ and the impact that Christ had on his life. In a letter that Theo wrote to Johanna, his wife, in 1889, Theo says about Vincent, "That head of his had been occupied with contemporary society's insoluble problems for so long, and he is still battling on with his good-heartedness and boundless energy. His efforts have not been in vain, but he will probably not live to see them come to fruit. For by the time people understand what he is saying in his paintings, it will be too late." And that's, in one sense, the end of the story, but it's only the temporal end. When you go to a museum, whether it's in the National Gallery in London or the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art or a museum on the south of France, and you stand in front of a Vincent van Gogh, the painting speaks. It speaks out to you. It speaks of a life. It speaks of a pilgrim who went the distance. I mean, he went the distance, even though his life was cut short. His life was a bit like a light bulb that got brighter and brighter, and then just went out. But it left so much light behind it. And that's something we have to look at in many ways, when I've heard you pastors talk about your experiences and your locations, I think back to Vincent's early life as a pastor and where he found himself, isolated, trying to bring the truth to people who didn't know it, and trying to ease people's pain, both inwardly and outwardly. And I thought, he would have related to you. He would have enjoyed your conversations. He would have known how you felt, because he felt that as well. And so, just to bring it to a conclusion, it's a sad story, but it's a joyous story as well, because trapped in those paintings is the joy of his life, the sermons he painted, the people he met, the troubles he had. Vincent was no saint, but he went the distance as a pilgrim. Thank you very much.